As U.S. Canada trade talks collapse, Carney says retaliatory tariffs will start Sept. The immediate development is a tariff fight moving from warning to schedule, with Canada preparing its own measures after Washington's 50% levies in the failed Friday talks. Reuters, CNBC, The New York Times, NBC, and The Washington Post all describe the same breakdown from different angles: retaliation, negotiating failure, and rising costs for integrated supply chains. Carney's miscalculation language matters because it tells businesses that Ottawa is not treating the dispute as routine posturing. Autos, parts suppliers, farm exporters, and border retailers now have to plan around a dated September action instead of a vague threat. The key evidence to watch is whether either side publishes product lists, exemptions, or customs guidance before the duties start. If negotiators restart talks, the first signal will probably be a joint statement or a delayed implementation date. If they do not, companies may shift orders, raise prices, or hold inventory while legal and diplomatic options develop. Viewers should separate political blame from the practical test: which goods get named, how quickly enforcement begins, and whether consumers see the costs, with Reuters and NBC reports making the cost timetable specific enough for purchasing managers, customs brokers, and provincial officials to model before September 8th and before invoices change. Tropical Storm Moke to cause more flooding as Hawaii recovers from Lala. Hawaii's emergency managers and national forecasters are warning that the danger is not just another storm headline, but saturated ground meeting a new round of heavy rain. NPR and PBS cite the risk of more than a foot of rainfall on the Big Island, while state emergency information keeps attention on local instructions rather than distant forecasts. The consequence is that recovery crews may be working in places where roads, drainage, and hillsides are already stressed from Lala. Flood watches can change quickly, so the practical question is which communities receive evacuation guidance, shelter information, or road closures. Tourists and residents face different risks. Visitors may not know flood-prone crossings, while local families may be protecting damaged homes. The next official record to watch is the Hawaii Emergency Management Update, followed by county alerts and NOAA track or rainfall revisions. A weaker wind forecast would not remove the water threat if rain bands stall over steep terrain. The public safety stake is whether crews can keep rescues, power restoration, and debris removal ahead of another surge of runoff, with NPR and PBS emphasizing that rainfall totals, not storm category, are the immediate measure for emergency managers and families near saturated slopes and low crossings. Trump's top trade representative details offer that Canada rejected. This second trade item explains why the larger dispute hardened so quickly. Washington says it put a serious proposal on the table, and Ottawa decided the terms were not acceptable. The New York Times, The Washington Post, Politico, PBS, and Fox frame the failed 72-hour window as a test of the administration's aggressive bargaining style. That matters because the argument is no longer only about tariff percentages. It is also about whether pressure can force a durable agreement between close partners. Canadian officials appear to have judged that accepting the offer would leave them exposed at home or constrained in future negotiations. U.S. officials are presenting the same moment as a rejection of the best available deal. Businesses should watch for documents, not adjectives, draft terms, sector carve-outs, retaliation lists, and any statement from the Trade Representative's office. If either side publishes details, markets can measure who would have absorbed the largest costs. Until then, the collapse leaves manufacturers and shippers planning for a political dispute that could become an operational bill. With Politico's 72-hour account and PBS coverage showing why process details, not slogans, may determine whether talks can restart quickly, with negotiators needing written terms, sector exemptions, and enforcement dates before companies can rely on any pause. Trump administration's 75-country visa ban was illegal, judge rules. The decision turns an immigration fight into a separation of powers test, because a federal court says the government could not stop visa processing for citizens of so many countries on the rationale it used. NPR, The Washington Post, CNN, The Hill, and AP all describe a policy aimed at people deemed likely to need public assistance. The ruling says nationality-based discrimination and the way the order was designed crossed legal lines. For affected families, the immediate question is not rhetoric. It is whether consulates resume processing, how backlogged cases are handled, and whether the government seeks a stay. For employers, universities, and relatives waiting on immigrant visas, timing now depends on docket entries as much as agency practice. The administration can appeal, rewrite guidance, or narrow the policy, and each path creates a different clock. Immigration lawyers will watch the next order text for whether the ruling is nationwide and how quickly agencies must comply. The broader stake is how far a president can push entry restrictions when Congress has already written detailed visa rules. with AP and the Hill coverage making the docket, consular guidance, and any government stay request the clearest indicators of real-world impact, especially for applicants already waiting overseas and relatives trying to preserve appointments. 2 Phoenix police officers arrested and fired after violent, unreported traffic stop. The core fact is not only that force was alleged, but that the encounter was not reported through the channels meant to trigger review. AP, The New York Times, The New York Post, KOLN, and AZ Family point to arrests, firings, and court documents that now move the case from internal discipline into the criminal system. That shift matters because prosecutors, not just police supervisors, will control part of the public record. The next evidence to watch is the charging document, body camera status, and any court filing describing what happened during the stop. Phoenix residents also need to know whether supervisors are auditing related incidents, because an unreported stop raises questions about detection systems. The department's firing decision signals that leaders saw conduct outside policy, but it does not answer criminal liability by itself. Community trust will depend on whether the case produces a transparent timeline and consistent consequences. Viewers should track arraignment dates, officer names in court records, and any city review of reporting procedures, with AZ Family's court document reporting and AP's criminal case framing making the charging record more important than department statements alone. While residents wait for video status, arraignment timing, supervisor review results, local oversight response, and any disclosure of prior complaints. Thousands in Northwest Indiana still without power nearly 2 weeks after storm. The outage story is a public resilience test because residents are measuring recovery in days without electricity, not hours after a weather event. NPR, the Chicago Sun-Times, SNJ Today, ABC7 Chicago, and NBC's local reporting describe thousands still affected, with one account putting the number above 20,000. NIPSCO crews and outside assistants are working through damaged infrastructure, but the long duration is why Governor Mike Braun's criticism matters. For families, the consequences include spoiled food, medical device risk, heat exposure, closed businesses, and uncertainty over when a house can safely reconnect. Some repairs may require property owners to fix damage before service returns, which complicates a simple utility restoration timeline. The next official information to watch is the outage map, municipal shelter guidance, and any statement explaining neighborhoods still offline. If mutual aid crews arrive from Illinois or nearby utilities, that can shorten restoration in the hardest-hit pockets. The broader question is whether grid planning and customer communication were strong enough for storms that leave damage spread across many communities, with ABC7's mutual aid reporting and NBC's account of the governor's criticism turning restoration speed and utility explanations into accountability tests for outage maps, repair sequencing, cooling centers, reconnection rules, estimated restoration windows, utility crew staffing, and vulnerable customer outreach. Trump reshuffled his portfolio in June, selling names like Meta and buying Berkshire Hathaway. The financial disclosure story is about scale and transparency. Reports describe just over 1,000 transactions in a single month, including sales of Meta and purchases connected to Berkshire Hathaway. CNBC Top says the June filing showed the reshuffle, and the Economic Times says the same disclosure listed 1,000 trades. The relevant question is not whether any one trade proves a conflict. It is whether the overall pattern intersects with public power, market-sensitive statements, or policy debates. Disclosures matter because they give watchdogs, investors, and voters a dated record to compare with public events. A sale of one technology name and purchase of a diversified holding company can be ordinary portfolio management, but the volume makes the review more complex. The next record to watch is any amended filing, ethics explanation, or additional transaction report. Analysts will also compare trade dates with market moves and official announcements. The viewer takeaway is practical. The filing is evidence to examine, not a verdict, and the accountability test is whether the details remain complete and timely, including transaction dates, asset names, filing corrections, and any ethics office response that clarifies control over the account, broker discretion, blind trust claims, or recusal obligations, and market exposure. Iran warns Middle East neighbors against joining U.S. economic war. Tehran's message is aimed less at Washington than at nearby governments that may be asked to cooperate with a new financial offensive. The Hill, CNBC, PBS, and the New York Times describe warnings tied to sanctions pressure, ship seizure threats, and regional diplomacy. That matters because economic campaigns work through banks, ports, insurers, energy buyers, and neighboring states that enforce or evade restrictions. Iran is trying to raise the political price for cooperation before those choices become public. Gulf governments, Iraq, Turkey, and other regional players may have to balance U.S. financial access against the risk of retaliation or instability. The next concrete signals are Treasury designations, shipping advisories, central bank notices, and statements from capitals that trade with Iran. A memorandum or diplomatic proposal can lower tensions only if it changes enforcement behavior on both sides. The public stake is whether an economic confrontation stays in compliance channels or spills into maritime security, oil prices, and proxy pressure across the region. With CNBC's Financial Offensive Framing and PBS Regional Diplomacy coverage showing why banks, ports, and energy traders may face fast compliance choices, especially if new designations name shipping firms, correspondent banks, energy buyers, regional central banks, insurers, port operators, oil shippers, terminal operators, or insurers. Zelenskyy details rift with Ukraine's dismissed Defense Minister Fedorov. The dispute matters because wartime leadership fights can affect aid confidence, military planning, and public morale even when the front line is somewhere else. PBS and AP describe Zelenskyy's account of the break, while Reuters, BBC, and the New York Times place it beside arguments over elections, corruption questions, and former officials. The key distinction is that a personnel dismissal is not automatically a government crisis, but it can become one if allies see oversight or strategy weakening. Zelenskyy's position appears to be that some actions by the former minister were misguided during a moment when Ukraine needs unity. Critics and investigators will focus on whether decisions affected procurement, battlefield readiness, or public trust. The next record to watch is any court action, parliamentary inquiry, defense ministry audit, or statement from foreign donors. Wartime elections are another pressure point because leaders argue they could fracture the country while Russian attacks continue. Viewers should follow documents and institutional reactions rather than personality drama, because funding and military coordination depend on credible governance, with Reuters on wartime election risks and BBC on corruption questions showing why allies will judge institutions, not only competing personal accounts. PBS says Zelenskyy described the rift, AP News says the dismissal drew scrutiny, and BBC says corruption questions remain active. UK's Burnham to visit Ukraine with plan to support long-range missile production. The British visit is being framed as a practical industrial pledge, not just a solidarity stop in Kyiv. Reuters, the Financial Times, the BBC, the Times of India, and other outlets describe support for long-range missile construction as Ukraine marks another year of wartime independence. The significance is that air defenses and strike capacity depend on production lines, blueprints, financing, and delivery schedules, not single speeches. If Britain helps expand manufacturing, Ukraine may gain a more reliable supply of systems for reaching Russian launch sites or logistics nodes. That could strengthen deterrence, but it also raises escalation concerns that Moscow will exploit in its messaging. The next evidence to watch is whether officials announce contracts, factory partnerships, export approvals, or specific timelines. European allies visiting Kyiv may add air defense commitments or funding that complements the missile plan. For civilians under bombardment, the practical stake is whether pledges become equipment quickly enough to change nightly risk. Viewers should track formal procurement notices and Ukrainian Defense Ministry readouts after the visit, with Reuters and Financial Times reporting making signed procurement language the difference between symbolic reassurance and usable production capacity, including whether Kyiv receives schedules, tooling support, financing details, export approvals, first delivery milestones, and training plans.